Hi, folks, and welcome to the second mini lecture of Week 9. Along with the social and industrial devastation of the United States, there was also pervasive environmental and ecological devastation and resource misallocation at the end of the 19th century. The amazing growth of the American industrial economy came out of the natural resources of the nation, whether it's timber, or fertile soils, animal stocks, fisheries, or water resources. Before the turn of the century, there were very few voices arguing for what we now call conservation. It just really wasn't part of the natural conversation about resources. Sure, there had been artistic movements, such as the Hudson River School of Painting, but these did not translate into larger social and government action. Few people saw the ties between devastated lands and the economic expansion as much beyond the necessary costs of industrial capitalism. In many ways, the emergence of the conservation movement came from the elites of American society. We see in Defending the Master Race that the organization of conservation groups such as the Boone and Crockett Club, the American Bison Society, and many of others came at the hands and influence of elites and big game hunters in pushing conservation practices. These groups were often exclusionary, as Spiro argues, explicitly based on the narratives of class and race at the time. And conservation also plays into ideas surrounding the state and control. If you're ever in the market for a book about agrarian and agricultural policy that'll really blow your mind, check out James C. Scott's Seeing Like a State. I think I end up citing it in most everything I write, but that's because it's a good book. Scott examines a political and economic ideology that he calls high modernism, which he defines as a muscle-bound version of the self-confidence about scientific and technical progress, the expansion of production, the growing satisfaction of human needs, the mastery of nature, including human nature, and the rational design of social order commensurate with the scientific understanding of natural laws. It was part and parcel of the administrative ordering of nature and the state, but it rested upon a nascent authoritarianism. The ideology of high modernism is legibility. The landscape must be able to be read by the administrators. Think about one of the major frustrations of the mine owners in dealing with coal miners in Colorado, which was the miners' ability to set their own working conditions in their individual rooms. This stymied control and oversight by the mine operators. We can also think about how a nation assesses taxes and conducts its census. It's far easier to do this from afar and standardize property taxes based off acreage or conduct the census based off of a generic form. But if we think about a forest, the wild is even more difficult to read and control. It's part of the way ecology works, but it impedes human control. Just as a coal operator would prefer to have machines doing their mining at the coal seam to reduce the power of recalcitrant coal miners, and tax collectors would like standardized rates, foresters moved towards an idea of high modern forestry. Effectively, legibility meant control. Take a look at these two images. On the left is a neat, cultivated, and managed forest. There is very little biodiversity, and each of the trees is in a nice, neat row. On the right, it's a mixed deciduous forest without much management. Sure, there's a trail there, but the trees aren't an economic resource in anybody's mind. They're just being trees. Which of these forests do you think has more birds in it? Which seems like better habitat? Which of these forests seems like it would be easier to log for timber? How difficult would it be to get an accurate count of trees per acre in each forest? Which forest looks like it's more resistant to erosion or flooding? Which would be easier to control during a fire? Which forest looks more modern or progressive? Ideas about efficient forestry and state control came to the US from Europe and spread widely in the early 20th century. However, the idyllic woods of the previous slide were far from the reality in many of the United States' forest ecosystems. The timber industry of the United States exploited its old-growth forests, felling massive, ancient trees and converting them into lumber for sale. At the same time, concerns over supply and cleanliness of water resources came to the attention of many policymakers. This was often thanks to a gruff, one-armed Civil War veteran and Western explorer named John Wesley Powell. Powell had lost his arm to a cannonball in the Civil War, but that didn't stop him from leading a U.S. Geological Survey expedition to navigate the Green and Colorado rivers to the Pacific Ocean. After that, he embarked on decades of lobbying in Washington to manage the West's water resources in a more efficient and effective manner. Powell and many others realized that healthy forests meant cleaner rivers and waterways, but also more predictable water flows. Combined with other conservation movements, especially the Boone and Crockett Club and the Audubon Society and others, a movement towards forest protection came into being. It culminated with Roosevelt's formation of the U.S. Forest Service, housed in the United States Department of Agriculture. Forests gained their protection as an agricultural resource for use, whether it was grazing, water supply and purification, timber harvests, or other uses. The conservationists realized that some resources, such as forests and rivers, needed government management to ensure the best possible use for the most people. Were they perfect? Certainly not. Am I personally grateful that the United States has national forests, national parks, and other public lands? Absolutely. Two men offer useful foils for the discussion of conservation in the U.S. Gifford Pinchot, over here, and John Muir, over here, standing next to Teddy Roosevelt. Pinchot represents the technocratic, efficient strain of conservation and forestry, whereas John Muir represents a more aesthetic, preservationist ethos. In the early 20th century, conservation came to mean efficient resource utilization to ensure stable future use. Instead of clear-cutting a forest all at once, forest managers allocated timber cuts to certain companies in order to give the forest time to regrow. Gifford Pinchot had studied forestry in France and then at Yale University and pushed for the development of the field, eventually becoming a major voice in the conservation movement as the head of the U.S. Forest Service. Pinchot called forestry, quote, the art of producing from the forest whatever it can yield for the services of man, and he aimed at conserving forestry resources for future generations. On the other end of the debate, John Muir stands out. Muir was Scottish, but had immigrated to the U.S. He began wandering the mountains of the West, particularly the Sierra Nevada range in California, and wrote broadly on their beauty and importance. He saw something spiritual in the mountains. He saw the mountains and woods as, quote, places for rest inspiration, and prayer. Muir was instrumental in protecting Yosemite as a national park and in founding the Sierra Club. He pushed for a preservationist ethos, the importance of preserving wild spaces, of removing them from the market as a mobile commodity, and realizing that they had aesthetic and recreational value. While there was plenty of internecine fighting and outright racialism in the conservation movement, the overall change was enormous. Before the conservation movement, forests were merely uncut swaths of lumber waiting for the saw and commodification, or savage spaces in need of the civilization effects of the saw. Conservation and preservation, therefore, transformed the ideology of natural resources away from immediate value extraction and towards stewardship for some future use for future generations. All right, that's it for this mini lecture, and we'll pick it up in the third one.